the interior of the field still has more dense grass vegetation than the exterior. So it is showing the utility of this gravel mulch technology. The gravel mulch was used for reducing erosion and also reducing evapotranspiration so the plants could retain the water. So that's what we'll be going through today is some of the different Pueblo agricultural techniques that we found on survey. So the big questions that we were looking at, the questions that we posed to the NSF, who also helped fund this project, is how does sustainable small-scale agriculture work in an extractive economy? So the economy became more extractive when Spanish colonialism began. The Spanish were exacting taxes on the Pueblos, so production had to increase to meet these additional demands. There were additional stressors that came with colonialism. So how did the Pueblos continue to be productive agriculturally? What technologies did they continue to use during the colonial era from the pre-contact era? What changed? What introductions did they incorporate? Did they incorporate wheat? If so, to what extent? Did they incorporate sheep and livestock? If so, to what extent? And what adaptations did they make? How do you increase production with or without having increasing resources? What are the gives and takes? So here you can see another one of the field remnants. You can see the field border here in one of the subdivisions. And then this is one of the sherds that we found on survey that was repurposed, as we could tell by some useware, as essentially an agricultural tool. So specifically, we're interested in how was Pueblo agriculture impacted by Spanish colonization? How did Pueblo agriculture and land use change through time? We also had some methodological pieces that we were interested in trying to figure out. One being, how do we answer these questions, specifically, which previously had been addressed using excavations or having to look at arroyo cuts to see the different planting layers? How do we do that without actually doing these excavations? So we adopted a pretty intensive coring sampling methodology, taking the soil cores, and so I'll talk about that. So the sites here, these are our sites that we surveyed. We surveyed 2 pre-contact sites, Cochualingue and Pueblo Blanco, and we surveyed 2 contact era sites that had some degree of colonial occupation, Cuyamungue and San Marcos. And we also wanted to have 2 different subregions of the northern Rio Grande to account for some microenvironmental differences between the regions. And here you're seeing a county map of New Mexico. So 3 of the sites are in Santa Fe County, and then Cochu is up in Rio Arriba County. So we were trying to have a multidisciplinary approach. We had some natural science methods. We did some paleoenvironmental modeling using reconstructions of precipitation and growing degree day or temperatures. And we used those to help figure out where environmentally were the feasible growing areas for our different crops of interest, which were wheat, an introduced crop, cotton, and maize, which are 2 indigenous crops. We also did some soil cores, as you can see some of the field crew doing here. We were sampling for pollen and phytoliths. Phytoliths are essentially plant fossils, so they give a similar reading to pollen, but they're a bit more precise because they're specific to plant part. And they also are more localized because they just drop where the plant was rather than being distributed the way pollen is. We also took cores to assess for soil nutrients and soil composition. Collaboration was also important throughout this. For the social sciences methods, we did the traditional pedestrian field survey that you would think of when thinking of archaeological field surveys. And then we also had a series of archival and ethnohistoric literature reviews. So just showing a little bit about some of the natural science models. Largely, this was based off of the Village Ecodynamics Project and also the Southwest Social Networks Project and PaleoCar. These have been largely developed through the work of the Arizona universities and also Washington State. You can see one of their papers here. And what they're using is crop growth trials, some yield estimates, grazing capacity, dendrochronology, based reconstructions of the niches for growing particular crops. And then we did all this coding in a system called R. And then what we're getting from these models is something like you can see in the lower right here. We're getting by year for the entire time period of interest of this project, the pre-colonial to colonial transition. We can get an understanding of where environmentally could the indigenous crops versus the introduced or the Spanish crops be grown. And so that's what this image shows here is the bluish areas represent where there was enough precipitation for maize, and then the orange and red is where there wasn't. And that's for one of the particular years of the study. So what we're using with this model is we're going to compare it against our on-the-ground survey data, which you can see an example of us taking a core from a field here. And we can see how do the actual spots where planting was occurring line up with environmentally where it should have been occurring. And then that lets us start to ask some more social questions about, why were they planting in the areas that they were, either if they were the best environmentally or maybe they weren't, and what technologies did the Pueblo people use to help meet those growing requirements if just the pure environment wasn't doing so. So we did do soil cores for pollen phytoliths, and then some basic soil chemistry. We also took some tree sections for dendrochronology to try to understand when the fields fell out of use, because once the trees start growing in the fields, that would indicate that the fields had fallen out of use. So we're trying to get at which fields were pre-colonial and which ones were colonial in the sites that had occupation that spanned both. What you're seeing in the image here are some phytoliths, and this is showing one of the phytolith processing steps where we filter out the clays from the soil and work our way down to the phytoliths. So there's one that looks like a saw blade here. That's a domesticated grass phytolith. So that could be maize, for example. We need to still analyze it further to determine if that's the species that it is. We also did some feature and artifact recording. This list here, we had 3 microenvironments for each site, a floodplain, and then sort of a mid-level upland around the village, and then the ridgetop terraces, which are the higher uplands. And what we were looking for is these types of agricultural features. You can see the list up here. And then we also were looking for datable artifacts, so ceramics found in field that would have been used as tools, such as this glazeware here that had an edge that indicated that it might have been some sort of digging or scooping tool. You can see one of the fields here in the foreground. You can see the corner of the field, some of the gravel mulch. You can see that the vegetation is still growing thicker in the field today. And then you can see some barrow pits up here, which we're still thinking through what the function of the barrow pits might have been. So in terms of archival research, we did find reports from the 1800s and early 1900s talking about the fact that what people had been told at that time and what they'd observed is that before the Spanish got there, the Pueblo people were using irrigation technology such as ditches, and we think we might have found some of those on our survey. Above all, the important method was community collaboration. So we did work with not only local landowners, such as the folks around San Marcos Pueblo here, but also with tribal members as well, consulting with tribes for the work on forest service land at Poshu, consulting with Santa Clara and Okealinge, and then actively working with members of the Pueblo Powake, which you can see here at the site of Cuyulungue. So where are we at progress-wise? Well, we have the agricultural potential model pretty much ready to go. So we do know for corn, wheat, and cotton, where environmentally, without any human field construction and intervention, where could these crops have grown? And then we have our survey data analysis that we're working on. So here you can see the main feature types that we found, and then their distribution between pre-contact and contact era sites. And then the part I'm working on right now, when I'm not chasing down shade structures and running programs at the state parks, is analyzing our soil samples, actually looking at the pollen and phytolith data. You can see another image of some phytoliths here. This little bilobe one is also one that comes out of potentially domestic grass phytoliths, or domestic grasses as well. So just to give you some images of what we were seeing on the ground at Socioeconomic, the blue is the floodplain area we surveyed, the red is the village, this little purple area is one of our upland survey areas, and this was sort of our ridgetop area over here. We covered 75 acres approximately, finding 69 agricultural features. You can see one of the alignments here, as well as here, and you can see the edge of one here, and one of our crew members taking notes. At Pueblo Blanco, we covered this area shown in yellow, and then we actually were able to extend a little bit into this area over here. We covered about 280 acres and found 33 features. So that's already showing a difference. Pueblo Blanco had a much less agricultural feature density than Socioeconomic did. Pueblo Blanco did have a lot more irrigation control features. We find check dams. We also found some beautiful chronologically diagnostic pottery, which helps us better understand the site. At Kaitlyn, and there were some sites sort of in between Kaitlyn and Puake, so they got labeled with potential affiliation to both. You can see again we have our upland areas, our ridgetop area in the dark purple, the floodplain in blue, the village in red. And this is showing the distribution of some of the features we found down here near the village. And then this is showing one of the alignments here. We found 33 features this year, plus 10 in sort of that in-between area, but we have been working at Kaitlyn for the past 5 years, the University of Colorado has, and so we have found dozens of other features in those previous years. At San Marcos, we have about 60 features we have 60 features covering about 167 acres. Here you can see one of the eroded terraces. You can see the terrace alignments here in that upper central image. Here are some of the local landowners helping with the soil coring. And then it was a little hard because everyone on the project was short, so we couldn't really get any great bird's eye view photos, but this was a field in the lower right here that had the cobble alignments and had some subdivisions. So that leads to questions of what was grown in each of those subdivisions of the field. Are they multi-cropping? Are they monocropping? And the pollen evidence suggests that they were multi-cropping. And we'll talk about that in a second. And then here's our surveyed upland ridge area, and then the area around the village in red, another survey area in light purple, and then the floodplain area. So the pollen analysis and the phytolith analysis, these are the parts, for those of you who attended the It's Cast talk that I gave in November, these are the parts that are new. So be extra excited about these ones. So we did complete the XRF analysis, which you can see up here. We scanned the soil cores to really hone in on where the agricultural lens was. And this allowed us to be able to find that agricultural lens without having to excavate and profile and see where that lens was stratigraphically. We could actually get that using XRF and watching changes in particular elements, such as phosphorus and potassium. And then iron and argon as well. Argon tells us something about the aeration or the soil turnover, so you can get a sense of when they were turning over soils. And using all these different elements together, we can figure out a likely spot where the agricultural lens was. So that gives us a starting point for sampling. The main takeaway from the pollen analysis of core samples was that we hit that lens pretty well. We found maize pollen in each of the contexts that was sampled that was a field context. So we were hitting that agricultural lens using this XRF coring methodology. We did also find native or wild cultigens in and around the agricultural field plots, such as beeweed. So that could suggest that those plants, we also found mustard as well, were being permitted to grow in that area and were being used potentially as cultigens. In the colonial era sites, we did find some evidence of veneering. So that does, we found a sporomyia, which suggests that certain plants have been passed through and then deposited out of livestock in these agricultural lenses from our time period of interest. So there might have been some manuring of the fields, but that's still something we need to research further. We did find some pollen grains that look like they could be wheat, but we need to study them further to determine that for sure. Because that was one of our questions is, are the Pueblo people incorporating and growing wheat at this time for their own use in their own village spaces? And then bulk samples. So we did also, in addition to cores, take bulk samples. They did suggest, as we saw from the survey data, in terms of, some sites having more field features than others, some villages are more agriculturally focused. We do see some villages, such as Kuyunmunge, intensifying their agricultural production based on pollen density, and also diversifying what they're growing to include more wheat and cotton. We see that as well at San Marcos. We do see cotton found in the gravel mulch fields, which would be expected based on previous literature. But we also found wheat in the gravel mulch fields, which previously people had thought wheat was growing in the floodplain. So this is going to lead us to have to do some more thinking about what crops are grown in what field types. The phytoliths, we were able to analyze 53 cores. We took 2 to 3 samples per core. We're finding lots of evidence of domesticated grasses from potential squash phytoliths. And then cotton is a big question. It's hard to tell if cotton phytoliths preserve. There's not a lot of literature on them. So we're trying to better understand what the cotton phytoliths look like. The phytolith analysis supports the pollen analysis in that we see an increased abundance and diversity of plants, agricultural plants at Kuyunmunge. And we also see the utility of the barrow pits. The barrow pits, if you remember, we'll go back up to find them. They are these features in the upper right here. They're these depressions that are sort of ringing the edge of the ridge around the gravel mulch fields. Some hypotheses think that those were dug out to re-gravel and re-mulch the gravel mulch fields. Other people think that maybe they were little water retention ponds because they tend to have a clay or a sort of calcified base layer to them that's hard to permeate. And so maybe they were these little water retention ponds for the field. Maybe they had another purpose. Maybe they were their own little small gardens. And we are seeing a lot of agricultural material in these barrow pits. We're going to go back down to the slide that we were working on. And back to our point about the barrow pit, for sampling, they were some of the best places to sample because we got a really good window into the crops of the area. So general patterns and takeaways so far, we are seeing more irrigation control features at pre-colonial sites, such as check dams. And so maybe that's because the colonial sites are utilizing the floodplain more. We did find agricultural evidence in the colonial floodplains, but that's something we need to research further. We did find more stone tools and evidence of stone tool manufacture at pre-colonial sites. More of these barrow pits were at colonial sites. There were larger field sizes over time, on average, at the contact era or the colonial era sites. We do see more shrines and field markers in the Tewa and Chana area versus the Galisteo, but maybe we just don't know what we're looking for in the Galisteo. We still need to do more research onto field shrines and directional markers and field markers in the Galisteo. We do have a difference in delineation of agricultural space. Some fields are bounded, others are not. We do see that some villages seem to be more agriculturally focused. And we did see that doing these agricultural feature surveys with targeted coring rather than full-blown excavations did produce data that we can work with. So the remaining work is to finish analyzing the survey data and the phytolith data, and then we need to compare those against the agriculture potential model and assess all the data together. So that's why I chose this image. Is based on the data so far, we have some pretty exciting things. Slowly represented by this glazeware and our smiling crew member right here, doing lots of writing and thinking, represented by this crew member here, and then lots of staring at the dirt confused, trying to make sense of the data. So that's sort of where I'm at right now. If the data's been collected, the samples are analyzed, with the exception of a few more phytolith samples, and so now I have to sit with all of it and make sense of it. So I welcome your thoughts on how to proceed with that, any questions you have. And so I'm going to hop back onto the chat.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. If you have questions, please post them in the chat box. I would also ask all of the audience members to please turn off your microphone and your camera. Go for it, Kaitlyn.
Okay, so yeah, so I turned off my screen sharing, but you can still probably see me awkwardly holding my phone, so thank you for bearing with the technology. Yeah, so I have the chat window open, so you're welcome to start posting questions in the chat. I have about 5 minutes to take questions before I have to run back to manning the state parks. Well, thanks for your comment, Carrie. Carrie said that it was exciting that we're finding such a diversity of plants. And yeah, I do think that'll be one of the things that will be an interesting contribution, is looking at just not only what plants were grown, but also how much the variety grown within one field plot. So that we're seeing more evidence of the multi-cropping, and also the encouragement of wild cultigens in the agricultural plots, such as the bee weed and the mustard. And yes, again, we have a comment about the length of time of occupation at the site. So San Marcos, for example, does have colonial and pre-colonial, and just a little tiny window of post-colonial occupation. And so trying to tease out what was happening in each of those times is something that I'm going to be sitting a lot with this winter and trying to better sort the data.
By the way, what I think is interesting for those of you who haven't read farther along in the program, Carrie Schleyer, who's providing some of these comments to Kaitlyn, her focus has been on San Marcos for quite a while. So I think it's interesting that both of these speakers are working in the same area.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, Carrie's been a great help with getting me introduced to the San Marcos area. And yeah, Carrie also commented that the fact that we're finding wheat indicates that there is some post-colonial field use, which, yeah, would be supported by the fact that we are seeing introduced colonial crops there, for sure.
If you have any more questions, we'll give Kaitlyn a minute or two more. Oh, I see there are questions coming in. Go.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, so we have annual meeting, which I believe is Katie saying, have you used any remote sensing to study irrigation features? So at my sites, besides the LiDAR data that Katie sent me, which I still need to pour through, I have not, but I'm looking forward to pouring through that more to see if we can pick up any. We are using that actually at Traveler's Rest right now, which is where I'm working now. Looking at, this is a Lewis and Clark campsite, and so we're looking at how the creek that they were utilizing, where it was when they were here, but that's a different project. So short answer is, I've used it for irrigation features, specifically looking at LiDAR, but I have not used it for my project site. But I will use the LiDAR that you sent me, and I will look up more about the multispectral imagery that you suggested. So thank you for that suggestion. And then, thanks, Katie. Becca says, how did you jump from studying trade between the Pueblos and plains via pipes, which was my master's thesis? So for those of you who were at the CAS annual meeting when it was in Durango, 2015 or 16 that was, you had to listen to me talk again, but it was about pipes and plains Pueblo trade. So Becca says, how did I get from that to agriculture? Well, my background is in environmental science as well as anthropology, and I've always been interested in trade and interregional or intercultural interactions. And so that was sort of the big picture that spans the pipe work and this work. Is I was looking at how do you facilitate trade in my master's, looking at plains Pueblo and tobacco smoking. And then here I'm looking at when colonial introductions are brought in, and how does that affect the land use system? So still kind of same big picture ideas of interest, just different location and yeah, different data. But I'm happy to be working in the field looking at land use stuff because that's my happy place. Yeah, thanks, Becca.
Any more questions?